I just didn't hear you. I saw you like getting kind of got that. Oh. Yeah. My bad. Oh no. And then like mix up, right? My John was like, oh, I've had a long day. He's like, yeah. What is
Thank you. I tried to match it on this week.
Final audio test.
Yeah, it's true. It's like, some kid is really worried about his job. So that's good.
Regretfully wasn't there, but I doubt I would have made any an extra run on the wings. She knocked my team out. Very like one of these players who has like fighting discipline, like doesn't run, he doesn't need to, and then when she does need to, on the other side of the field in 2 seconds.
Good hour and
My team is very good. Lots of like sheer physical ability, but not we hadn't played together that much. So
I like. Now I feel like I'm more. Yeah, I mean, I don't know where.
The lectures are very exciting.
So good. Wait, what? Yep, I can't miss what time. Yeah. Okay. By 9 o'clock, Arjun's lecture on Thomas Carlyle. Okay, have you read? Yeah. Have you read the Latter Day pamphlets?
Not their entirety. The main work I'm familiar with.
Yeah,
And I heard it's broadly represented, kind of contextualized.
yeah, Chartism is really good, and Heroes on Heroes and Hero Worship is also. But you have to understand how to read it. Oh, the Carlyle is.
Yeah, this is just, I mean, I'm very impressed by how very good. Yeah, an expert in many.
Yeah, I've been seeing a lot of stuff on like this.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you that there's a reason that there's.
I was
Yeah, not in like. Not that I have it. Yeah.
Good to see you, Anna.
I don't know. I'll but I guess we'll be able to. That's frustrating. No guarantees. No guarantees.
Test.
There are many.
Test.
Oh, yeah.
Next week, a lot of special programs. No, yeah, it's just something you have to say. I don't know what I just want to give out.
Mike 1030A. Test 1 2. Test 1 2.
No, I think it should
Harvey, are you all set to go?
Yeah.
Your microphone's
It's on.
okay.
Welcome everyone. Now, there's a number of gentlemen in the back who graciously got up. Do you guys want to just come sit on the floor up here so you don't have to stand? Here. And there's 2 chairs over here, but you're fine. Thank you for offering your seats as well. There's one right here too. Thank you, everyone. This is quite a turnout. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Philip Munoz. I'm the director of the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government. It's my pleasure to welcome you. This is our last event of the semester. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for those watching online. Since it's our last event of the semester, I have a few end of the year announcements and then some thank yous I want to make. Okay, so four short announcements. First, there's a sign-up sheet going around. If you want to get on our email list that's being passed around, just give us your name and email, and we can make sure you're on our list, and then we send out emails. You can find out about our events next year on our website as well. But if you want to be on our email list, give us your name and email. For our students, we have a writing prize. In fact, two writing prizes. We call them the Publius Prizes. These are for student journalism, and then students who publish articles in the national presses. So if you want to nominate someone, or if you publish something and want to be considered for one of our Publius Prizes, please go to our website, constudies.nd.edu, and you can learn about the Publius Prize. We're offering our core text sequence next year. This is a year-long course on classic texts of citizenship and constitutional government. Professor Mary Keyes and Professor Sue Collins are teaching it. And it's a wonderful class. I'm teaching it right now. Professor Deneen taught it with me this year. And we have a few openings. So if you're interested in reading fundamental texts such as Tocqueville with two of Notre Dame's very best professors next year, come talk to me about it, or we have a few seats open. So you should have a look at that. And then finally, our Tocqueville Fellowship. This is a student fellowship, which I'll say a bit more in just a second, where applications are open for the Tocqueville Fellowship. So students who want to get more involved with the center, that's the best way for them to do it. In fact, why don't I start here? The center fosters research. We foster teaching about the Constitution. And undergraduate students are at the heart of everything we do. Can I have all the Tocqueville Fellows, current or past Tocqueville Fellows, who are here with us? These are our students. Stand up, just so. So these students are students who've met with our speakers. Some of them met with Professor Mansfield in a seminar this morning. You apply to it, and it's a semester-long fellowship, though it runs in perpetuity, a semester at a time. And this is our way that when we have speakers like Professor Mansfield come to campus, if you're a Tocqueville Fellow, you have an opportunity to meet with them privately, to share a meal, private seminars. So if you're interested, for those students who aren't current fellows, if you're interested in the Tocqueville Fellowship, find someone who's standing right now and ask them about it. It's one of the most important things that we do here at the center. So thank you, fellows. We're able to do the things we do because the center has a terrific staff, and they're very hardworking and they're very devoted, and I just want them to stand and be recognized. So Debbie O'Malley, our associate director. Jen Smith, Jen has just come back. She's from maternity leave, and she has with her Porter, who's about 8 weeks old. She's probably taking care of Porter right now. And Zane, where's Zane? Zane's probably with the food. Well, Zane and Debbie and Jen make everything we do possible. So thank you to the staff. Another extraordinarily important element of our work here at the center is we foster scholarship. And one of the ways we do that, of course, with our own Notre Dame faculty, but we bring in faculty members and visiting fellows from outside the university. And I just want to thank and recognize our current visiting fellows. And we have 3 with us today. We have 4, but 3 with us today. So Luke Foster, Luke is teaching, and he'll be back next year as our postdoctoral fellow. Just finished his PhD from the University of Chicago, and will be teaching classes in American political economy and American political thought. And is working on turning his dissertation on liberal education into a book. So thank you, Luke. Mary Frances Myler. Mary Frances is our postgraduate fellow. Mary Frances is writing the Notre Dame version of God and Man at Yale. And it has been tremendously productive. And I wish you could stay for another year, but she's off to Washington, D.C. to do other things. So thank you, Mary Frances. And then Rick Averminko. Professor Averminko is a full professor at the University of Wisconsin, has been here for the year with us, writing a book on Tocqueville, and has become a good friend and a great colleague. So thank you to Professor Averminko. Okay, I think just one other announcement. and she's not here. So we're losing a staff member. Soren Greffenstadt, who the visiting fellows can know, does everything for our undergraduate fellows. And she was an undergraduate fellow herself. She wrote her undergraduate thesis on Tocqueville, Tocqueville on women in the family. Unfortunately, at least from my perspective, she understood Tocqueville a little too well and has decided that she wants to retire from public life to take care of her private life. So she's stepping down from her position. In fact, she's home right now. Soren, I hope you're watching. She's home right now taking care of her babies. So we will miss her, and I wanted to thank her publicly, but let me thank her in this way for really everything she's done for the center for several years. So thank you, Soren. Okay, we have a tradition here at the center. Because undergraduates are so important to what we do, we have an undergraduate fellow introduce our speaker, Brian Joseph. Brian, econ major, PLS major, pretty good books major, a Tocqueville fellow from Chicago, and my golfing buddy from time to time. Brian will introduce Dr. Mansfield. Brian?
Well, thank you, Professor, for the introduction, and I look forward to our next round of golf soon. I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker for this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Harvey C. Mansfield is the William R. Kenan Jr. Professor of Government at Harvard University. He studies and teaches political philosophy, has written on Edmund Burke and the nature of political parties, on Machiavelli and the invention of indirect government, in defense of a defensible liberalism, and in favor of a constitutional American political science. He has also written on the discovery and development of the theory of executive power and is a translator of Machiavelli and Tocqueville. In 2006, he published a book on manliness, and in 2010, one on Tocqueville. His most recent book, Machiavelli's Effectual Truth, Creating the Modern World, is forthcoming in 2023, hot off the Cambridge University Press. Professor Mansfield was chairman of Harvard's government department from 1973 to 1977 and has held the Guggenheim and NEH Fellowships, having been on the advisory council of the NEH. In 2004, he received the National Humanities Medal from the president, and in 2007, he delivered the annual Thomas Jefferson Lecture sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. In 2011, he was awarded a Bradley Prize. He has also been a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, but he has hardly left Harvard since his first arrival in 1949 and has been on the faculty there since 1962. I hope one day my resume is as long as his. The topic of his lecture today is how to read Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Please welcome me in joining Professor Harvey Mansfield.
Well, thank you very much, Brian. That was a very able introduction. It could have been shorter. And welcome. Thanks very much for having me here. It's always a thrill to come to Notre Dame. And although I have yet to attend a football game, I'm looking forward to changing that past history of neglect. So, and I want to see the Fighting Irish in charge. And it's good to see that you won't have to skip lunch in order to listen to my little talk, which is called How to Read Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And that means attentively. And that means philosophically. And that means as a whole, with a structure that makes it a whole, It's not a collection, as it sometimes may seem to be. A whole revealed as it proceeds, a whole which is not immediately apparent. On the other hand, I have to admit that I'm only going to give you half of this whole. So this is a half whole talk. Now, in the Tocqueville, in the introduction to Tocqueville's wonderful book, much is revealed. Democracy is said to be a revolution. Democracy is a revolution. It democratizes itself. It becomes ever more democratic. It is a permanent fact and a generative fact and a providential fact. Permanent fact, I'm not sure. He doesn't say eternal, but at least for a very long time, as far as we can see. Generative fact. It's a fact which generates other facts. Providential fact. You have to think what would be the alternative to providential, and that might be, I think, fatality, fateful, blind fatality. It is not something that has no meaning, not simply an accident. It's going to be contrasted with aristocracy. So when we read about democracy, it's not without an alternative, as so much of today's democratic theory is. Tocqueville, of course, was well placed. He was an aristocrat, born in 1805, so after the French Revolution, in which his family, not his near family, his father was imprisoned, and his hair turned white at the age of 22. That was a fearful experience. So he knows aristocracy and democracy. As I said, born 1805 when Napoleon was coming on the scene. There's a lot of theory in this book, which is not always immediately apparent. But he says he's going to study the image of democracy itself. That's a title, Democracy, would be the image, but it's in America. It's not just democracy without an example of it. So it's a theory which is in practice in this country. He comes to America not as a European looking down on a backward civilization, as did many other Europeans coming here. For example, his relative Chateaubriand. But the America is so far from backward that it's ahead of Europe. It shows the future of democracy. That's what's there to be seen. But democracy has what he calls intellectual miseries, which can be seen especially in Europe, where democracy is just coming into being. Intellectual miseries, not just moral, not just political, intellectual. And he gives 6 examples of this, the different kinds of parties which exist, especially in Europe at the same time. Perhaps the main one is the party of religion as opposed to the party of liberty. Tocqueville wants to change that. He wants to show that the party of liberty can be the friend of the party of religion, vice versa. This to his, you could say, reactionary companions in France. But I want to stress this, that democracy has a problem. And the problem that it has is that it degrades souls. Tocqueville said in a letter that he was a new sort of liberal, not like the other liberals. Here's one big difference. He gives us liberalism with soul. The 17th century liberalism, which preceded him, which I call the sort of official liberalism of Hobbes and Locke and Spinoza, spoke of the self. The self is a kind of prosthesis for the soul. You know, again, it's an artificial leg. You've lost your leg, you get an artificial one. It's a kind of substitute, but it isn't the whole thing. So the self is not the whole thing. We also have a soul. And his criticism that he presents here is that democracy lacks a legitimate authority. Democracy means everybody's equal. When everybody's equal, no one stands out. No one is an authority. So government still is necessary. And when government makes a command, people say, why? Command. We're all equal. You're not the boss of me, as even your child might say. You're not the boss of me. So Democrats naturally treat authority with doubt and suspicion, and yet they still have to obey. So they're obeying an authority which they don't regard as legitimate. And that's what degrades their souls. It's not just that they feel rebellious, but that when they can't act on their rebelliousness, they feel suspicion and unhappy. Aristocracy may be unjust, but it's more humane than democracy. Aristocrats have a humane or human relationship, say between serf and noble. Serf is not a very good place to be, but at least there's somebody who's responsible for you. And so there's a relationship there. With equality, no. It's inhuman. The relationship tends to be contractual. Or if it's between inequalities, it tends to be doubtful. Why is it inhuman? Because democracy seems to have a temptation to materialism. In the 17th century liberalism, the end of man is self-preservation. That is true of anything alive. Anything that's alive wants to stay alive, but anything that's alive is going to die. So everything alive has some means of defending itself, some kind of immunity system, as we call it, and some means of reproducing itself, something that happens after you die. So this is a little picture of the things you find in the introduction. Tocqueville says of these partisans whom he's identified, 6 of them, he's going to see further than the way they do, but not differently. He's on their plane, but he's above. He's above. He's a 7th kind of partisan. Volume 1 begins. This book has 2 volumes, as you know. The first came out in 1835, was a huge success, was sufficient to make Tocqueville, at the age of 30, a member of the French Academy. And and the second volume came out 5 years later. In between, he read some philosophy. He had a couple of Americans as research assistants. And that book came out in 1840. That was less popular. It was a little more difficult or dense, less American, more democratic, is the way one could sum it up. How does volume 1 begin? It begins with something non-human, the geography of America, the wonderful Mississippi Valley that God laid out for our continent, for our country, uninhabited or inhabited by Indians, of where there are records, tombs of a past civilization that came and went, leaving nothing but a tomb, the most permanent manifestations of humanity. And compare what we have with what poor old Australia has in its center, red dust, where hardly anything can live, which has none of this black dirt that provides for so much food for so much of the world. That's in the middle part, the flyover part of America, which Tocqueville celebrates here. But the geography of America is not the cause of America. That's what comes out from this. Here's a beautiful condition, but the condition doesn't bring the cause or doesn't bring the result by itself. So that's not the cause, as if it were materialism, which out of matter could produce something living. No. So chapter 2. Chapter 2 is the point de départ, the point of departure. That's the Puritans. The Puritans came here not for gold or for adventure, but on a mission. And they called themselves pilgrims. And they were animated by an idea which was a religious idea that contained a political theory. You see how first in the introduction he spoke of providential fact. Now it's becoming a little clearer. And in the introduction too, which I didn't mention, he said democracy had had its beginning 7 centuries before. And that was in the Catholic Church, when the church started to take the priesthood, into the priesthood, people from the common people, not merely sons of aristocrats. That was a beginning towards democracy. But democracy wasn't, though it was always there, wasn't visible and obvious. The coming of the Puritans, a democratic theocracy, made democracy apparent in broad daylight, au grand jour. I'm going to throw in my little French if you don't object. In broad daylight. Every regime, he says, is in a sense democracy because every regime needs a people. And it is in a way ruled by that people, even when the people itself doesn't rule, because you have to take account of the people. But to have the people now rule, all right, in broad daylight, that was something new. The Puritans lived with a biblical fragrance. They took their names from the Bible, children's names from the Bible. They were, however, in a way, too close to God. They wanted to give their regulations and their laws the punishments that might be just if they came from God, but not from human beings. So they had too many punitive measures, too many capital punishments. And they weren't usually carried out, but attached to too many misdeeds. So they suffered from over legislation. And this one, the sort of thing that you see portrayed in Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, which was written a little bit after this book came out. And so the first cause is an idea, but it has to be developed. Somehow the distinction between man and God needs to be clearer. The distinction between human and non-human, same as in geography. How can man be his own first cause? And Tocqueville starts to use that phrase, that very heavy metaphysical phrase, first cause. Sometimes he says it in the plural, first causes, because it's a question, is man his own cause, or God, or nature? So he speaks of, now in chapter 3, of what he calls the social state. That's a new term which has earned Tocqueville the dubious honor of being the founder of sociology. And as if society comes before politics. Or is that really the case because it turns out there are two kinds of social state, a democracy, a democratic state, and an aristocratic state. So somehow the politics, democratic is a politic. Democracy means rule of the people, or rule of the demos, is already in society. How did it get there? At any rate, so he blurs the distinction between society and politics. With Aristotle, it's more clear that politics comes first. And he speaks of, he speaks of the social state. He doesn't speak of the state of nature, as you get in official liberalism of the 17th century, Hobbes, Locke, and Spinoza, this wild and war of all against all, which is characteristic of the 17th century liberalism that I think Tocqueville is criticizing and wants to improve upon. So in the social state, certain laws are given, laws on inheritance. Is it primogeniture? Everything goes to the eldest son. That's an aristocracy where the purpose is to maintain the mansion or the manor or the domain of the family. So to keep the family strong and united. And that's why the elder son gets everything. Keep it one thing. Or equal inheritance, which cuts up whatever property and gives it to all the children equally. That's more democratic, but you see it's opposed to the maintenance of a landed family or a landed aristocracy, which is the true kind of aristocracy according to Tocqueville. So an inheritance law is a law which is a choice, but it's a law which deals with, decides for what happens to your property after you die, which is not a choice. So it's a mix of choice and non-choice, of choice and necessity. The first cause of human intent envelops what is the non-human fact that all life dies. again, a critique of, or an implied critique of the philosophy of self-preservation. You can't really preserve yourself unless you preserve your family. You have to deal with succession. That's succession, is the French word for inheritance. So what is human takes responsibility for what is not human. And this is a way of connecting the human and the non-human. Or the man makes himself the first cause by taking over, by taking responsibility for what he isn't really responsible for. This is the meaning, the kind of paradoxical meaning of the word responsibility, a very important word in American political science. As you see, it's a featured word in the Federalist. And at first you think that when you say, I'm responsible, that means it's for something you did. But when you're in an office, as they say in the Navy, on your watch, everything that happens is your responsibility. When you get married, you take a vow in sickness and in health. You didn't want that sickness, but it came. Still, it's not your choice, but you choose to take responsibility over things that you're not responsible for. I think there's an example in Thomas Aquinas. He says that it would be better if you could walk in the hot sun without sweating. But if you choose to walk in the hot sun, you choose to sweat. This is what I mean by saying the way you take over responsibility that way. So the first cause becomes the sovereignty of the people. They are the first cause. And Tocqueville, in a strange paragraph, says the people rule in America like God, as God rules the universe. The people are the cause and the end of all things, so to speak, replacing God. But of course, the people are not really God. They don't rule all things, except in this strange way. The sovereignty of the people then can then be understood as the sovereignty of man over his own deeds, his own affairs. But religion remains. Tocqueville has lots to say about religion. Man's religion to God. Religion means this is what is the part of faith that concentrates on what binds you to God. Religio means binding. God allows man to choose. So religion is God as viewed by man. And at the end of Democracy in America, Tocqueville comes back to this, as I'll be showing you. Now, if the people are sovereign, if then man is sovereign, sovereignty has forms by which it exercises sovereignty. It's divine. You can't govern something without formal organization. And so Tocqueville begins discussing the forms of government in America. The township. This is Tocqueville's famous discussion of the New England township. He knows that all of America is not New England, which is still true. But he chooses New England to illustrate what government, how it first begins. The township is a spontaneous thing. It naturally grows out of human nature, and especially in America, where towns were formed anew on the frontier. This would have been in the frontier at the time of Tocqueville. When he visited America, he went to the frontier, which was in Michigan, Upper Michigan. So, and this is the first step to civilization. Yeah, one building in the woods, and then there's another and a third, and you decide, well, we'd like to get together, so we'll build a road. When you build a road, you need to have people working together. You can't do it by yourself. People working together, well, you need somebody who's in charge. And those people have assistants, subordinates. There's a certain expertise that may exist at the beginning, or that more likely grows as you continue to do the work. So I used to have a place in New Hampshire where they had a volunteer fire department. Consisted of 5 guys who lived in the town, and they had one of them was called lieutenant, and the others were called sergeants, and they all thought of each other as chiefs. So there's a lot of royalty in that spontaneous outfit. And Tocqueville speaks of the term in English, select men. That's still used in a New England town, select men, those who are selected or elected to office. So these people, through this kind of organization, are not exactly perfectly equal. Okay? Democracy, in order to govern itself, even at the lowest level of spontaneity, requires offices. Offices establish formal inequalities, but they don't challenge the principle of democracy, because that person who holds the office, he's the chief of the volunteer fire department, he's not better than you. He might be a better fireman, though not necessarily, but he's just in a place, in an office, which gives him authority over you. So you can obey him without degrading your soul, because he's not challenging the principle. It's just, it turns out that democracy requires this somewhat undemocratic organization. The social state, therefore, is not merely social. It has these forms. It's divided into these forms of government, which enable and are required for acting together. Forms yield useful inequalities. Because they're useful to the rule of the people, they don't challenge the principle, even in a democracy. They make possible freedom. They, in some ways, limit your freedom. The firemen can order you around. The policemen too, also. They limit your freedom, but this makes possible the best freedom, the highest freedom, the freedom of self-government. Now, Tocqueville then proceeds through these higher forms that are not so spontaneous, but that have to be thought out somewhat more. And he comes to the administration of things, where he approves of decentralized administration. It's good to make rules at the center, but it's good to administer those rules always decentrally where they are applied. And the judiciary he speaks of, and governors. What does it mean to govern? In chapter 6, he speaks of the need for judging men. Sovereignty can't simply be ruling over people who have no recourse. Sovereignty, to be sovereign, needs judges to check the first forms of the legislative forms, the laws that are passed, need to be checked by judges. And so these judges are within the law, but they criticize the law or make it possible for it to be judged itself. So there's a kind of feedback system, say, within sovereignty in this way. And we see this, of course, in the American Constitution, which makes a distinction between constitutional law and ordinary law. Constitutional law is made by the people. Ordinary law is made over the people by their representatives, but still by them. The people can change the Constitution, but they have to live under the ordinary law. And then he finally comes to the Constitution in America, a work of rationality, a work of art, very complicated. It somehow manages to combine two rival theories. What is a union? Is a union a union of all the people, the American people? Or is it a league of the American states? So, and we have, as you know, both those principles in our Constitution mixed intelligently, so that though there are always disputes, boundary disputes between the states and the national government, still they live together in a situation which once was thought to be impossible, because it was a lack of, you would have a lack of sovereignty if people could be ordered by two different governments. And yet you're under the government of Indiana and the government of the United States. They both ask you to pay taxes. Somehow we manage this confusion. This is defended in the Federalist, on the Federalist number 39, very nobly by James Madison. So all this is part one of the first volume. And it ends with a view of the legislator over the whole of government by the sovereign people. So this is, and plus the chance that enters into this new creation. He discusses presidential elections, which he likens to a storm that passes through with a lot of noise and trouble during the election, but everything settles down afterwards and it passes through. Part two of volume one is on informal power. First part on formal power. The people rule in America, he says. That's how it begins. And this goes beyond the forms that limit it. So it isn't the case, as the Federalists decided so optimistically, that majority rule or majority tyranny can be conquered and done away with. What the people want, they will get. That's what he says. Finally, even if the Supreme Court is against what the people want, ultimately the people will win out. Informal institutions which are outside the Constitution, like our parties, not mentioned in the Constitution. Very important, obviously. Parties are great and small. Great when great issues, revolutionary issues are at stake. Small when just personnel is at stake. And he mentions the Federalist Party as an example of a great party, the party which passed the Constitution. I mean, an aristocratic party somehow that got us started with the Constitution, with these great figures, the founding fathers, whom we still name with respect and in some cases reverence. Then there are weapons of parties, the press and political associations. The press, what does it do? It formulates issues for the people. The people have feelings and various opinions, but it's the press that formulates. See, that word form is in the verb formulate, gives them form, so that we know what alternative issues we face. In this way, the few who write in the press are important in democracy and to democracy. The press is based on what it likes to call the right to know. This is not really the case. The people are really incapable of rational conviction, thinking a thing out to its end and coming up with only correct result. No, the people either believe or they doubt. Belief in a people is characteristic of aristocracy, doubt of democracy, for the same reason as before, that in democracy there's no authority. So now we're all equal. Well, where's my guide? You look around, well, I'm as good as that person, and so on. And finally you say, well, what do the others think? And public opinion becomes your guide. You look around, you don't find anyone who stands out. So better go with what most people think. So you never act, so to speak, on your own, but you're always looking over your shoulder and around, like being at a dinner party when you're young and you don't know the rules. Political associations are still characteristic of America. Student associations in American universities. In my university, they used to have these bulletin boards. It's all email now, but used to have bulletin boards with all kinds of events going on. And these were almost all student groups trying to get you to do something together, that sometimes political, sometimes religious, sometimes athletic, different things. A couple of hundred. Whereas if you go to a university in Europe, on the bulletin board is one or two bulletins and some professor's talking, and he's been sponsored by the university. And so that's what you get. Here in America, we associate. Association is natural. It's the most natural affair after individual right. Man is social for Tocqueville, as opposed to 17th century official liberalism, where you need a social contract to get you out of the state of nature. But here, it's right next to your individual right in importance and in value, your right to associate. So individual rights become active through association. If you just sit there with your right by yourself, it's not effectual. You've got to associate in order to bring it into effect, to do something with it. So informal associations are, to some extent, artificial, but they also depend on our natural inclination, the fact that we like to be with other human beings. So Tocqueville speaks of the art and the science of association. And the science he even calls the mother science of association. And he uses association in many ways throughout his book, including the conjugal association, or the American association, or the human association. There are associations which are natural and which you can think about, form a theory for, and be an object of your contemplation. And then the art of association, how actually to go about getting people together. And people write business books about that. The art of association. So that's theory and practice. This is Tocqueville's political version of virtue. Rights, because rights become actual through association, are close to virtue. They're not the right of self-preservation based on fear of violent death, as you get it in Hobbes and Locke. These informal associations give authority to the majority. New majorities change the status quo. Through association, you're not stuck with the majority that presently exists. You can change it. There are temperance movement, abolitionists, and these are both in Tocqueville's time. But the consequences are doubtful. Majorities are not always right. They're always arbitrary. There's an arbitrariness to it. And Tocqueville builds up to the danger of majority tyranny. Popular sovereignty becomes majority tyranny. The majority has the advantage that it can't have any interest contrary to its own interest. But it makes for a patriotism, but also for a sense of omnipotence that surpasses freedom. Majority tyranny can occur even over thought. This is on, I mentioned this because I want you to look it up. On page 244 of the official translation. Yeah. And where Tocqueville says that there is nowhere less freedom of mind and spirit than in America. Read that and think that through. True on that one. The power of the majority is a continual fact, even if it sometimes is used well. And its power is tempered by three things. First, decentralized administration, that the laws are administered by people you know in your locality. Second, by the influence of lawyers. Lawyers are kind of aristocratic, a democratic/aristocratic element in America because they love forms and formalities, legal language. That's what they are. That's what they believe. That's what they live by. That's what they charge you for. It's a democratic set of aristocracy. And third, juries. Juries teach Americans how to rule. The main thing they teach you is having a law doesn't just settle an issue. Because when you're on a jury, you have to see individual circumstances, people who have run up against violation of a law. And you see that a generality like a law doesn't always fit a particular situation or a particular defendant. You have to think about that and apply the law. Chapter 9 presents the principal cause is maintaining the democratic revolution in America. Its geographical situations, and it's off by itself. This is an accident. We're away from Europe and its wars. Thanks to Providence. The different use of the word Providence. Before it was providential fact. Has some meaning to it. Now providential means it's just an accident. It's owing to. Which is providence? Is it an accident or is it a cause? Or somehow both? And then our laws, which he's been discussing. And third, the mores. Tocqueville is one of the great promoters of mores, together with Montesquieu and Rousseau, two other wonderful Frenchmen whose writings he read and borrowed from. Mores, especially religion, and this is the first discussion of religion. Religion limits human sovereignty. It limits democratic sovereignty. It limits democratic tyranny. It sets barriers to popular will. It tells you things that are sacred, things that you won't do or mustn't do. It sets barriers. And it does this especially through women. Religion is sovereign over woman, he says. And women, in turn, are sovereign over mores. So the law is more important than circumstances. Mores are more important than laws. And women are more important than men. Mores develop gradually. They work insensibly, not openly. They work indirectly. Yet they come from laws. Mores are a kind of combination of choice and non-choice of man and nature. And that takes us to chapter 10 on the three races. And chapter 10, this is the end of the first volume, is the culmination of the danger of majority tyranny and the story of majority tyranny of the whites in America over the blacks and the reds. He discusses the question of race with respect to both blacks and Indians or reds, what is called peau rouge. Redskins is literally in French. The blacks stand for slavery and civilization. And the reds stand for freedom and savagery. So Tocqueville gives a discussion of blacks and slavery in contrast with the Indians. And this is, I think, very unusual. It's not done today. It's only the discussion of blacks is blacks versus whites. But he says this. He says that blacks show the extreme of slavery. They think of themselves as the possession of another. They have no pride, therefore. They imitate whites, and they want the civilization of whites, but they are rejected. The Indians, on the contrary, are free, not slaves, and they're proud, not servile, say. But they're too proud. They have illusions that they tell each other of their ancestors, happy hunting grounds, and so on. In their pride, they reject white civilization. They don't want it because they don't like it. They find it too constraining. The whites he calls man par excellence. That means man as distinguished from an animal. But if you use other human beings as if they were animals, What kind of excellence is that? Tocqueville doesn't say blacks are inferior in race. He rejects the theory of races, which was very popular in his time, and one set forth by an actual friend of his, Gobineau, the Count of Gobineau. This was a kind of racism of the different ranks of the different races. I think the word today, racism, is overused. Ism means a theory. And so this is a kind of prejudice which comes from a theory, racism. Whereas I think what most people mean by, in practice, by when they say racism, they mean racially prejudiced. And it's not a worked out theory that this race is distinctively better than others. So the discussion of races leads to a discussion of the relation of pride to liberty. Pride regards requires the knowledge of man's place in nature. And you can't just take it for granted like the Indians who can't preserve themselves because they can't control their freedom. The blacks can preserve themselves, but they can't keep their freedom. They have no dignity. They have dignity only when they liberate themselves from slavery. Obviously, the great case of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass escaped by himself. You know the story. I hope you know the story. I hope you've read his autobiography. In 1836, just after this book came out, and it was in 1845 when he produced the first edition of his autobiography. So Tocqueville didn't know about Frederick Douglass, and he also didn't know about Abraham Lincoln. Those were two surprises for him that might have come. The Indians had a choice of war or civilization. No multicultural solution is possible. Indians were hunters and gatherers, and the whites who came upon them were farmers. And the whites would chase all the game. So there was nothing left for the Indians to hunt and to live on. Those two civilizations couldn't be made to live together. So at the end of chapter 10, there's a discussion of America's future. The most formidable evil that is slavery, and their greatest danger is a civil war between the races. That's what he mostly feared, blacks versus whites. And then volume 1 concludes with a comparison of America and Russia, which was a wonderful thing during the Cold War. It looked as if Tocqueville had sort of predicted this whole challenge that we faced. America stands for man over nature and democratic liberty, equality in liberty. Russia stands for man over man and democracy, democratic equality in slavery. And yet America does both. See? Which of those two will prevail? So that's the end of volume 1. And since I told you I was going to give half the whole, it's just about the end of my talk, I say reassuringly. So the second volume came in 5 years later, in 1840, also has a preface. And Tocqueville says that the two volumes are complementary. They should be read as a single volume. There's a lot of scholarly opinion which thinks, however, that the two are quite different. And that, for example, volume 1 speaks of majority tyranny, volume 2 never. Volume 2 speaks of soft despotism, volume 1 never. So soft despotism seems to substitute for majority tyranny. There's a big danger facing America. But how would they be complementary? And here's my idea, that volume 1 stands for form and matter. The form means the form of government, and the matter means what actually happens, the people as matter act and overwhelm the forms and thereby make tyranny. So you have this problem of form versus the matter. Form means democracy under control. Matter means democracy leaving or abandoning control. Volume 2 then is on the end of democracy. How does democracy deal with nature, with the nature of human beings? And the general answer is that democracy democratizes. Democracy democratizes democracy. The end is the democratic way of life. And there are 4 parts to volume 2, and I'll just give you the name of the 4 parts. The first is called intellectual movement. It's the first time that phrase is used today. Intellectual historians speak of intellectual movements in the plural. This means intellectual movement. How does your intellect move you? And it does in 2 ways, just like Aristotle's soul said. One, it enables you to act. The soul enables you to act, your intellect. And second, your soul enables you to reflect and to feel shame or to feel conscience, to examine what you have done or what you have thought. So that's intellectual movement. How do Democrats move rationally? They have a tendency to doubt because everybody's equal, but they also have a tendency to dogmatize. So they move from doubt to dogma, and the two seem to be connected. See? When you're doubting, you can't doubt everything. Otherwise, you're always sitting there asking yourself questions. It's just if you get hungry, you need to get up and assume you're worth living. It's worth living. I'm going to have a sandwich. But how did you know it's worth living? So you need a dogma. The dogma enables you to move, and the doubt enables you to think. Then part 2 is on sentiments. How does democracy deal with individuality of human beings, which leads to the preoccupation of each person with his own, or individualism. Tocqueville uses that word, which for us is usually praise. It's good. For him, bad. Individualism means losing your sense of public spirit because you live under such vast forces, which have been pointed out to you by democratic historians, that you feel weak and incompetent and go despair of accomplishing anything in your life. So you fall back into yourself and your family and your close friends, and you live together with them, all huddled together in individualism. Never vote. Mores, that's part 3. How does democracy deal with apparently necessary inequalities? Master and servant. How do you do that? And then within the family, 5 chapters on women, on the famous 5 chapters, men and women, the inequality of the sexes, at least in traditional terms. How does democracy deal with that? And then last, how does democracy deal with honor? Honor is above the materialism of the body. Honor is what you would give up your life to protect. Right? That's your honor. How does that manage? That's a fact. People will do that. Therefore, they're not simply given to self-preservation. People are also given to sacrifice for the sake of honor. Again, a departure from the official 17th century liberalism. Fourth, how does politics preside over the whole? And we come back to the question of the first cause. Now, the first cause is not our origin, but our end. And Tocqueville comes back to God. Democratic government is called the immense being. That's what it tends to produce, an immense centralized administration that acts as a schoolmaster, making little rules for you. Think of COVID. Okay. Tutor, that's the French, a tutor, say a schooler, schoolmaster, tutorial. But of course, the real immense being is God. So what God sees is Tocqueville's topic in the very last chapter of the book. And he begins by contrasting democracy and aristocracy. He sums up the two regimes. What are the pros and what are the cons in each of them? He says this is difficult for himself. He doesn't see what God sees, or what we, in any case, being human beings, don't see. What does God see? The whole. He sees all human beings with their similarities and their differences. Before he had said, democracies tend to deal in generalities. We like to make broad generalizations. Aristocracies are interested in individuals. God is interested in both. Democracy and aristocracy are partial truths. Therefore, they are incomplete wholes. We, in a democracy, choose to see all human beings as alike. And in aristocracy, they choose to see human beings as separate and distinctive. There's never a complete or perfect fit between form and matter, between democracy and human nature. And therefore, the form is always arbitrary to some extent. Tocqueville is with Plato on this. Democracy is like a cave. Democracy is truer in some respects than aristocracy, maybe in most respects, the most important respects, but it doesn't have the full truth. Yet it is driven to maintain that it does have the full truth. So democracy makes a democratic society. Democracy, therefore, is not fundamentally pluralistic, as we like to say. It's all democracy. But it can have aristocratic aspects, not so-called, not identified as such, which improve democracy. They do so inconspicuously because they don't challenge the democratic principles, like offices, as I mentioned before, or lawyers, or forms in general, or meritocracy. Then we're all equal, but we have certain tasks that need to be done. So pick up the trash. That needs to be done. So how are you going to choose those people? You can have a lottery. That's the most democratic thing. But maybe you will get from a lottery people who aren't competent to do that job. So you go by merit. Merit is the least objectionable way of making democracy perform democratically. To make a distinction of Aristotle, demotic in the sense of always being what the people is, and democratic, meaning the rule of democracy. So the rule of democracy requires these inequalities. And the most democratic way to fill them, if not by lottery, is through merit. So meritocracy. So democracy is not only a form of government, but an end. And that is the subject of volume 2. The standard in judging it shouldn't be, is this democratic? That is it in keeping with democracy? It should be, does this make democracy work better? Does this reach the end of democracy, which is equality and freedom together? When democracy is taken as an end and not merely as a form, right? You can use aristocratic institutions or ideas as a means to that end. So in Tocqueville's democracy, aristocracy becomes a means to democracy. The democratic revolution is a providential fact. Providence. God makes us resigned to facts, but without killing our spirit, for a design that we cannot fully know. The intelligence of God, then, is to see the whole in all its similarities and differences. God is above man, but he is still a model for man. In democracy, the practical attention or upshot is pay attention to particulars, not only to general ideas. This is a kind of aristocratic advice to make us more democratic. Thanks.
I know some students and faculty probably need to get to the 2 o'clock classes, so feel free if you need to get to class to teach or learn. But those who can stay, we can let those who need to go, and then we can have some questions.
I went past 45 minutes. I went well past 45 minutes.
Made up for us running out of time. Class. Okay, our students are dutiful and not wanting to skip class.
But also in not wanting to leave the lecture.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna take the prerogative. We're gonna turn to the students, but I want to ask one quick question since you mentioned Lincoln. What do you think Tocqueville would have thought about Lincoln, the man, and Lincoln, that Lincoln became president?
Well, he is the one who succeeded in, not in avoiding war, but in getting a democracy to abandon slavery. Democracy had much more trouble abolishing slavery than a despotism. The Tsar abolished serfs like that with the snap of his fingers in 1861. But we had a lot of partisans of slavery who were very willing to fight for it, as it turned out. When that war started, neither believed that the other would stick to it. They both thought that when they saw how serious we were, they would give up or abandon this silly insistence. But no, I think after Antietam, I think it was, they both saw that both sides were, it was mutually obvious that both sides were in it for for the course of it. So, and Lincoln managed to abolish slavery by getting the North to fight against it. But it's a difficult thing to fight for somebody else's freedom. Don't think that. But I mean, because it's easy to think now, I would have been an abolitionist. But does that mean you would have fought and risked your life? So there were a lot in the North who didn't like slavery, but who didn't want to fight either to abolish it. So the problem was to get them to fight for something that they would fight for, and that was the Union. So the Union, I'm just giving you my little Lincoln explanation. So the Union was the way, it was by means of the Union, which meant that the extension of slavery was not going to happen, and the final fate of slavery would be that it would be abolished once a majority got strong enough big enough to do that. So that was why the South fought rather than compromised there. But that was so they fought on the issue of secession and the Union. It was the Union Army. It wasn't the anti-slavery army, but it did the job. So
Does the fact that Lincoln could gain the presidency and muster the will of the nation to end slavery, does that testify to democracy's nobility or its weakness?
Of course it does. Yes, to its nobility. The weakness is right. It comes from its strength. That people will insist on having their way and defending their way of life, even if it's based on almost total injustice.
Elizabeth is going to come around with the microphone, so we'll go to any students. Okay, Michaela? And Michaela, identify yourself too.
Hi, thank you, Professor Mansfield, for your talk. It was great. I am Michaela Brems. I'm a third-year PhD student in political science here, and I am currently studying for my political theory comprehensive exam. And Tocqueville is on that reading list, and I saw your very short introduction about Tocqueville, and I was tempted to, maybe I could just read that and I don't have to read the whole thing. But inevitably, I'm working my way through your translation. I enjoyed a lot. But I did read your very short introduction. And one of the things you say in there is that Tocqueville has sort of this rhetorical strategy that he uses in the sense that if he thinks a particular institution or association might be useful, but isn't at its full potential, he'll actually exaggerate how well it currently functions, and he'll give praise for that, for instance, the jury system and things like this. So I guess I'm wondering, when we're reading Tocqueville's account of how the jury system or how townships function in America, how much should we keep that in mind? How much of this rhetorical strategy is he bringing in versus is he just accounting how it actually functions?
It looks like description, and then you say, oh, well, I know plenty of juries where there's no teaching going on. but it's meant to illustrate what could be. A good way to give people advice is to praise them for virtues they don't have. And then sometimes that lets them see that they could deserve the praise they're getting if they only paid more attention to doing it.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Professor. I'm Sammy Roberts. I'm a history PhD student here, a former student of Paul Ray's at Hillsdale, though. So I learned to closely read from your translation, so I appreciate that. It's been a while since that class, though, so I wanted to ask a question. Could you elaborate on Tocqueville's experience of the American South, just to kind of go back to that? Like, where did he actually go? Because it seems that if the New England township is his point of departure, kind of like almost the case study for thinking about democracy in America, it would seem like that would give a very slanted view to what you kind of capture in the American spirit. Because I mean, there's many more folkways than just that of New England. And like when you talked about the Constitution as, it finds this balance between Union and Confederation. Well, it ultimately didn't succeed in holding these two different regions together. And so I guess my primary question is just factual. Where did he go in the South? And I just wonder if any kind of lack of experience in certain places there might have changed any of his reflections.
He went down the Mississippi to New Orleans and then through Louisiana, Alabama, some Arkansas, Carolinas, and up north to New York, from which he left. Passed through Washington. Andrew Jackson was the president. He didn't talk to him, but he talked to John Quincy Adams, who had been the preceding president. So yeah, he had plenty of opportunity to see that the New England township was not universal in America, and indeed he mentions that. But it's the model that he wants to give in America that's important. Part of his voyage was going through on the Ohio River. He took a steamboat which sank and had to save himself. But there's a famous, I think this is in chapter 10, this discussion of looking at Ohio and Kentucky on the two different borders, on the two different sides of the river. And activity, bustling, prosperity in Ohio, free state, lassitude, languor, inactivity in Kentucky, the slave state. So he was aware of it.
I'm from Kentucky, so I can say
it's true.
It's not much to change.
Well, you could say so was Lincoln, in a way.
Other questions? Yeah. Professor Avermenko.
Yeah, thanks. Richard Avermenko from the University of Wisconsin. And I don't want to correct you, but when Tocqueville went to the frontier he got to was Green Bay, which is Wisconsin, not Michigan. So I ran across a passage last week, Tocqueville letter to Courcelle from 1853, and he says, I'm going to read, it's very short. Man's true grandeur lies only in the harmony of the liberal sentiment and religious sentiment, by working simultaneously to animate and to restrain souls. And my sole political passion for 30 years has been to bring about this harmony. So the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty need to be combined together. And we are at Notre Dame, so I'm wondering if you might have some thoughts that help me on which kind of religion Tocqueville saw as the best suited for bringing about this harmony between the spirit of liberty and the spirit of religion.
Well, he has a chapter on Catholicism and the advantage it has in democratic countries, and to its greater appeal to common people, I think. It was a Protestant country, still is mostly. So democracy in America is going to have that flavor. When he speaks of religion, of course, he means Christianity. Christianity has the advantage over Islam and Judaism of not having a law. And so a specified law which tells a devotee how to live. And it's just repeat this morning, the only two really references to politics in the New Testament, obey the powers that be, and render unto Caesar what is Caesar, unto God what is God. So that leaves a possibility for separation, that I hate to use that word because it's too strong. The difference between church and state in Christianity more favorable to political liberty than when you have a sacred law. And so this makes this gives an advantage to the Christian religion, and it's an advantage which it's better for the church, he thinks, and it's better for people. It's better for the church not to get involved in worldly disputes, which put its authority on one side rather than another, and is really not, the difference is not really necessary to it. And so its theology and its morality will be purer if it stays out of worldly establishments. But it's also better for democracy if it's liberty and democracy if it doesn't impinge on and use its authority to decide a question that could easily be decided by the people.
This was the subject of our seminar this morning.
Yes, it was.
The students, yeah. Okay, please, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Professor. My name is Shasta Cole. I'm at the Political Science Department here, a PhD student. I do political theory and IR. So thank you for your lecture and for helping remedy the general and especially my own inattention to Volume 1 in favor of Volume 2. So I really appreciated your lecture. And it has caused me to think about almost the two aspects of democracy that Robert Dahl lays out. So the first one is a kind of universal access to public office, which is a higher position in the necessary formal hierarchy, be it by merit or something else. And then the second is the empowerment of the people themselves. And it seems to me very much, for example, in Machiavelli, that he seems to speak of us with a certain kind of disdain for the former in favor of the latter a lot of the times, especially in the discourses, because once in a republic people come to a position of power, they kind of become part of the oligarchy. So I was just wondering, in Tocqueville's account of democracy in America and the ideal democracy in general, which might be different, what is it that, which one of the two, if there is one, does set democracy apart from the European system?
The European Machiavellian system, you mean?
Well, just like, you know, what Tocqueville is more used to seeing. What is the difference that are either of these kind of aspects a kind of inclusion into ruling versus a freedom? Are these at odds with each other according to him, or are they kind of in conflict at all, or are they kind of going together and successfully going together in America?
No, I'm still a little doubtful. The people do rule in America. He says that.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't just that they are ruled by their representatives, but their representatives turn out to be representing their views. And if they don't do that, they get thrown out of office. So either in the short or the long term. So that is a kind of definite statement of what's what.
Okay.
And who's who in a democracy. And in Machiavelli, no, it's more that the people are much more malleable, manipulable.
Right.
And that in the end, they always need a head. They are not themselves a head. In the end, they always need some princely authority. In the end, the republic is always a kind of principality.
Right.
I think, and so that would be a difference.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering if he thinks that America has been able to achieve that balance. So it sounds like he does.
Well, no, I think he leaves it a question. I mean, certainly the race question was open, much more open then. It's still open today, and so that's not resolved. it's working a working success. Put it that way. I would say. Yeah. Yeah.
Question in the back.
Clark Forsyth, thank you, Professor Mansfield. After reading you for 40 years, it's a pleasure to finally get a chance to hear you lecture. Two questions. The first is, could you share your fitness routine with us? And the second is, we hear rising voices on the right and the left over the last decade, especially kind of challenging Republican institutions, small r, of course. Do you think we should support Republican institutions, and how can citizens do that?
Yeah, well, stationary bike is what I do right now, plus a few exercises. Walking is good. I don't always do it though. That's Providence. Right. Housework. Yeah. Yes, I'm still for updated liberalism, Tocquevillian liberalism, or some. I'm not. Within that updated liberalism. I'm sort of on. I just say I'm on the conservative side, but I expect and will be thoroughly capable of tolerating losing. That's what you have to be. You have to have a kind of halfway love of liberalism understood as a society of rights. If you're going to have rights, you have to have elections. If you're going to have elections, you're going to lose some. If you're going to lose some, you got to continue. And so you have this kind of halfway house. Your half victories are always dimmed by the possibility of future half defeats. And so that's the kind of balance that we need to have, and that will keep us healthy. At least now, I think this is especially necessary to stress. There's a kind of conservatism which is tired of losing, and that makes it tired of liberalism, and I'm not with that.
Right here, and then we'll come to Luke.
My name is Eric. I work in the library.
Yeah.
A long time ago, I had the opportunity to chat with President Ford. And I asked him, I said, if you could choose any kind of government, what would it be? And he just gave me the political answers. Oh, what the kind we have now. And I go, oh, fine. But you articulated and compared, you said that the subject of the talk basically compared and contrasted democracy with aristocracy. Great. And he was looking at specifically at America. Yay. Well, at that particular time, the United States was young. And we're not really very old now. But compared to when he was looking at it and to when now, it has, we've aged significantly compared to how long it was. And my question is, he described and defined and articulated the advantages and disadvantages of democracy then. And I'm curious to know if you believe we have learned about the advantages and disadvantages of democracy and evolved, and has democracy evolved since then?
It's evolved, but maybe not in a good way.
I'm not saying a value judgment. I'm just curious to know, how has it changed? How have we looked at it and said, this doesn't work, we're going to change that?
We need a value judgment. So yes, this book is not a perfect thing to read to understand everything about American politics today. That's for sure. There's other books, more recent, that should be read, but none of them are on this level. This is the best book on democracy and the best book on America, both together. That's my. I've said that before, but I'll say it again. So he tells us many things that we don't see, or things we overlook. some of them, I meant to give today.
Luke Foster, I'm a postdoc here with the center. You mentioned volume 2, part 3 on sentiments and then on inequalities. And I wanted to ask you about
That's on Maury's.
I wanted to ask you about the place of honor, right?
Yeah.
Because the description of honor takes him immediately to armies. And he says militaries in democratic societies present this paradox because men come in, and he's talking to about male armies. Men come in accustomed to equality.
Opposed to female armies.
Indeed.
Yeah.
They come in accustomed to equality with one another.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they find themselves in very rigid, strict hierarchies, which are a direct inheritance of the aristocratic age. And he says, it's very difficult for democracies, therefore, to retain the loyalty of their warriors. Right? And then I often compare that with the discussion of education, right? He says, you should read the ancients, read these aristocratic warrior stories, but not too much, and not too many people should read them. And so what do you think is the relationship? I mean, these are two elements of honor culture that still survive in democratic life, and yet immediately, while affirming their necessity, there's also this warning and this caveat. How would you relate those two things?
He divides the Democratic Army into officers and men, and the men are willing to fight and can get caught up in a feeling on behalf of for the sake of war, whereas the officers, they're like tenured professors. They get weary and they lose their ambition, and since there's no war to fight. But the real difficulty, the real problem comes from the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers. I don't know what Napoleon started off as a corporal, I don't know, or maybe he encouraged corporals. Also, he brings in Machiavelli. There's a hidden relationship between Tocqueville and Machiavelli.
I'm going to get one final question in, which is, do you have a favorite part of democracy in America, a favorite passage or a favorite insight, favorite chapter?
No, as a translator, I love it all.
Yeah. This is Professor Mansfield taught his last class at Harvard last week.
That's right.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I think you've been teaching at Harvard longer than I've been alive.
Mm-hmm.
And so this, I think, is your last public lecture as a regular faculty member.
I guess that's right.
So thank you for doing it here at Notre Dame. And thank you for your visit.
Well, thank you for having me.
A few copies of your translation.
Yeah.
Professor Pearl again. I have a question for you that I want to ask you.
Yeah.
It's about Tocqueville's psychology, his political psychology.
Yeah.
And I think there's a dynamic that he identifies that is under discussed in the secondary literature that I let me just get this. Okay, all right. You're a junior.
You want to tell me that? And I'm reading Tocqueville in a couple of my classes, so hopefully I'll have my big
I want to read that man again. At Notre Dame. And so, yeah, there's this dynamic.
I've never tried. I've never been there. I kind of want to do it.
Try sneaking one on you. And it isn't.
I know, I would love to have that. I heard, yeah, he was organized. Okay, that's it. No, we have a great Big you guys? Yes. Are you going to confirm like right immediately? I was like, I
How did the board do last night?
I'm trying to like get off of it. So I was like,
I was asking what Tom Mineral earlier this morning. So I got that. We spoke at that.
I did not even write paper. Thank you so much. Yeah, I had 9,000 data points. Family dinner, and I know every single variation of mine. That is like really? I know, mine was a good too. I mean, I'm sorry. It was great. I love my kids.
Oh, I didn't see it. I guess so. Yeah.
Yes.